These are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Butler from FaithTrust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Addressing Elder Abuse Within Your Faith Community. I'll introduce our presenter in just a moment, but first there are a couple of technical details that we should go over. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your headphone is plugged in, or your headset is plugged in, or your speakers are turned on, and that the volume is turned up. If you're having technical problems, I recommend that you log out of the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then reconnect through that link. All the audience members are muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. We'd love to hear from you. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation, and I will hold on to them until the last 15 minutes, and we hope to answer as many questions as possible. If for some reason you don't see the question box, click on the small orange arrow at the top right side of your screen to expand the feature options, and you should be able to get to the question feature there. The slides you see on your screen will be sent to you today as a PDF, so you'll have them for your future reference. Lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join us for the live presentation, so welcome to those who may be listening sometime in the future. We would like to thank the United Methodist Women for sponsoring today's webinar. It's part of a series of 5 that the United Methodist Women are sponsoring in 2015 as part of their domestic violence awareness campaign. Their mission is to provide opportunities to grow spiritually, equip women and girls to be leaders, provide transformative educational experiences, organize for growth and flexibility, work for justice through service and advocacy. Please visit unitedmethodistwomen.org to read more about the great work that they're doing. And again, we thank them for their sponsorship. Our presenter today is Reverend Dr. Sarah Reith. She is an Episcopal priest serving as chaplain at Pinnock Village, a faith-based continuing care retirement community in Southern Pines, North Carolina. A diplomat in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, Sarah has served as a pastoral psychotherapist and consultant in independent practice in North Carolina and New York. She works with many survivors of childhood abuse and domestic violence, including in the retirement community where she now serves. Her dissertation and published works focus on the healing needs of survivors of abuse. She's worked with judicatories to develop policies, procedures, prevention training, healing protocols, and pastoral response teams to address abuse in the church. And we are so delighted that she's here with us today. Just a reminder, audience members, if you have questions, please submit them anytime, and I will hold on to them. And now, Sarah, I'm going to introduce you and let you take it over.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for joining this webinar. If we can move to the next slide, please, Sarah. The goal for our webinar today is that we will address the types of abuse that elders experience, some warning signs of abuse, and then how the community of faith may be empowered and responsive to the vulnerabilities of our elders. With this coming Monday, June 15th, as World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, we're very grateful for your interest and care and commitment to be here today. So let's jump into the deep end. If we can move to the next slide, please, Sarah. I want to spend a bit of time with you talking about different types of abuse, beginning with physical abuse. That is the use of physical force to cause pain or injury. It can include such things as slapping, bruising, restraining a person by physical or chemical means, treating a person roughly. This is the easiest type of abuse to detect, although we can't always detect it. Multiple and severe bruises, welts, bone fractures, open wounds, bed sores, burns, scalding, untreated medical needs, restraining a person for the purpose of isolating him or her. These would be some of the ways that abuse or some of the signs of abuse that we could recognize and be concerned about. Next, sexual abuse. That's a kind of abuse that, as with children, so with adults and elders, it's not so apparent to family and friends and church members. Sexual abuse of an elder is non-consensual sexual contact of any kind, touching on up to full sexual intercourse and other forms of fuller sexual release. With elders, the issue of consent is complex because many elders have cognitive decline, and so a person may engage in sexual behavior with an abuser without being able to give authentic ethical consent. So we need to be mindful of that. Sexual abuse of an elder could include exposure to pornography, physically exposing the naked person to other people, or exposing with lurid photos. It may become apparent during medical exams, for example, a sexually transmitted disease or a vaginal infection, bruising in the breast and genital areas, and so forth. And emotional and spiritual abuse is another kind of abuse that our elders experience. That is the inflicting of mental and spiritual pain through verbal and nonverbal means that rob a person of his or her dignity. Such behaviors as threats, bullying, insults, intimidation, humiliation, harassment, using undue influence with the person. We would notice perhaps some hesitation on the part of the elder when a particular person is around. The person might go into a kind of helplessness or internal collapse. You might find them more withdrawn, more uncharacteristically unresponsive in their communication, afraid, agitated. They might express some spiritual confusion and distress. Again, because with our elders there is frequently cognitive and physical decline, the behaviors that a person might exhibit, such as fear, agitation, may or may not be a sign of abuse. And that is why our own embodied relationship with the elder is essential. Exploitation can happen in many ways, but what we see most frequently with elders is financial exploitation, which is illegally and or improperly using an elder's money, property, or other material assets through the use of forgery, stealing, deceit, trickery. We've seen this done by family members, powers of attorney, guardians, caregivers, telemarketers. And the financial exploitation can also be a motivating factor behind other kinds of abuse. You might notice a particular person in the elder's life with an entitlement attitude, a you owe me kind of attitude, demanding my inheritance now. Another sign of exploitation might be the lack of care provided when there is enough money for appropriate care for the elder. We need to be concerned about abrupt changes in a will or a power of attorney, financial documents, unpaid bills, behaviors on the part of others such as, this is my new best friend. I've seen this happen in my counseling practice, counseling adults whose loved one signed a new will under duress and was ethically and legally unable to render consent, but has caused tremendous harm and profound consequences in people's lives. We want to be concerned about changes in banking and spending behaviors, also isolation from the community, and an unusual fear of the caregiver. Neglect and abandonment is another kind of abuse, and that is the failure or the refusal to fulfill the duties of caregiving and with the elder. The obligations are not met. What we have found, statistics have shown that 24% of abuse allegations are of caregiver neglect. So that's 24% of reported, documented allegations. With any of these statistics that I'm going to be offering today, we can never know how precise they are because so much of abuse throughout the age spectrum goes unreported for multiple reasons. Neglect and abandonment can manifest in there not being proper food, shelter, personal safety and safety precautions, proper clothing, proper medicine and medical care. It can include the failure or refusal to pay for in-home care services to provide needed care. Neglect and abandonment might be intentional, where someone is purposely keeping the person safe from harm. It can also be unintentional, such as through the lack of knowledge or the inability to provide for an elder. Some signs of neglect and abandonment can be skin breakdown, poor hygiene, malnourishment, dehydration, excusing the behavior of a caregiver when a question is raised, lack of heat or running water, unsanitary or unclean living situation. Here, your eyes and your nose can be a resource for detecting that kind of abuse. And then finally, in the forms of abuse, we have self-neglect. That statistics show 28% of all investigated reports are of self-neglect. This is a situation where a family member or the family may be involved in a limited way because of their own choice, because of historical issues in the family, or frequently, in my own experience, it's because the elder is insisting on being independent, even though that independence is at their own risk. And the self-neglect may also be exacerbated by dementia that is settling in, substance abuse or dependency that impairs judgment and capacity to manage their own health and affairs on the part of the elder. There are other kinds of vulnerabilities that elders have. And Sarah, if you can move to the next slide, please. Whoops. How did I get out of order here? I'm sorry. Power and control. The abuse of elders takes place in the same way that other abuse takes place, abuse of children, sexual exploitation of adults in a professional trust relationship. It is the need to exert power and control over a person who is vulnerable and in need of your care and your trustworthiness. And the person uses intentional cruelty and or neglect that ends up causing harm or creates a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable elder. And this is within a relationship of trust. We move to the next slide, please. We know that the abuse of power and control is never an oops, whether, again, we're talking about abuse of a child or the abuse of an elder. It's not an oops. It's a planned, strategized, intentional, usually intentional behavior with elders. We know that 90% of abusers of elders are family members. It can be adult children, spouses, especially when it's domestic violence, partners, and grandchildren. It's difficult for people who are living in what's called the sandwich generation, baby boomers who are caring for their children, maybe raising grandchildren as well, and also have their parents to care for. So that's just a vulnerability that people in that generation may carry and could be at risk for becoming more domineering to try to get control over a very unmanageable situation and very difficult situation. We know that as we age, our vulnerabilities increase, physical vulnerabilities, cognitive impairment. And then another vulnerability that we know that our elders have is that at this time, 70% of the nation's wealth is controlled by individuals who are 50 years old and older. And so that means that the generation of 50 years old and older is more vulnerable to financial exploitation, again, through power and control, not through an oops. And then if we move to the next slide, other vulnerabilities include our elders who live with lifelong disabilities, people in hospice care, elders who are caring for their adult children who have a persistent mental illness, who live with mental retardation or long-term disabilities. And as the elder and the adult child with these difficulties get older, the ground begins to shift as the elder becomes more and more overwhelmed caring for this vulnerable adult child. We have elders who are caring for grandchildren because perhaps the grandchild's parent is in prison or substance abusing. We're also finding that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered elders are vulnerable for a number of reasons. They are less likely to report abuse for fear of being discriminated against, not being taken seriously, because there may be a life pattern of surviving by isolating themselves, ghettoizing themselves, to stay away from the heterosexual and heterogeneous community. There's also a fear of a high risk of being condemned through the religious beliefs of caregivers, being punished, treated with contempt, refusal to allow the spouse or the life partner to be part of family meetings and gatherings, refusal to take that partner or spouse seriously. There's a wonderful movie that you can acquire and watch, which is called Gen Silent. It's a 2010 documentary that reveals very poignantly the isolation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered elders. That resource will be mentioned in the resource section of this presentation, and you'll have that on your slides. If we move to the next slide, abuse can happen anywhere. It's usually in a place where the elder lives. The abuse of power and control can come out as the expression of frustration and impatience, which it's normal for us to feel that way with someone who's slowing down or doesn't seem to cooperate with what we want to have happen. Our feelings are normal, but if we are not working on taming those reactions and feelings, we're at risk of abusing. Other risk factors for abusing our power and control with elders have to do with denying that our loved one is coming to the end of his or her life. We might push the person emotionally or physically too hard. It's hard not to push too hard when we're having trouble facing that dad's coming to the end of his life. We don't want to let him go. We also may be at greater risk for abusing our power and control by denying our own need for help and support for ourselves and for the elder. There may be family patterns at work there where there's kind of a rubber fence around the family. We're fine, when we're really not fine. But we have fierce independence in our family. We keep our family matters to ourselves. There may be a family culture or a religious culture that there is shame at reaching out for help that's needed. I'm thinking of an elder that I know of who had profound bodily shame after having had colon cancer and a permanent colostomy. That person refused care to the very end because of the shame of the colostomy and the smells and all of that. And then if we're not really aware of our conscious and unconscious conflicted feelings about the elder in our life, those behaviors will, they'll start to leak out the cracks as we interact with our elders and deal with their needs. Our age-old unresolved conflicts with a parent, for example, or we may resent their dependency and their need. Their need may be really inconvenient to us. We may resent that they're unable to nurture us as they once did. And so it's important for us to be aware of these kinds of feelings and get support for them, not to be ashamed of those feelings, but know that they're normal and then get adequate support for ourselves so that we don't take it out on our elders. And now if we move to the next slide, please, Sarah. In the 2010 census, we learned that 13% of the population is 65 or older. That's 40.3 million people. So lots and lots of elders, and baby boomers are going to be upping that number tremendously in the next census, I'm sure. Only 1 in 14 cases of elder abuse actually comes to the attention of authorities. And so again, statistics, as I mentioned, may be not 100% accurate because so much of abuse goes unreported. Of 1,000 people surveyed, 41 reported financial abuse, which is a greater percentage than the self-reported rates of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse or neglect. And then if we move to the next slide, please, we know that the risk of abuse is higher if the elder is living with dementia. 5.1 million elders over 65 have some kind of dementia, and in replicated studies, close to 50% of participants with dementia had been mistreated by caregivers. And so why might that be? One thing has to do with the power struggles that we can engage in to get the elder to do or maybe not do something. Those power struggles can become physical. We can't always reason with the person. We get frustrated. We may feel profound sorrow and even rage at the loss of the relationship as it once was. And then, so the cognitive impairment of the elder plus a relationship of supposed trust can be an at-risk situation if there is not enough support for the family and the caregivers. To a person, everyone I know who has been a family member or caregiver within the family of a loved one, an elder loved one with dementia, says that the disease of dementia, whatever variety, is so much harder on the family and the caregivers than it is on the elder at a certain point. So that points to some of our pastoral care strategies that I'm going to mention a little bit later. Now if we move to the next slide, I'd like you just to take a moment, please, to look at this slide and the next briefly, to look at what would be some risk factors for abusing. This is not to go on a witch hunt for, and find an abuser behind every door, but because we are members of the faith community, we are likely to see the functioning of the family and see the relationships where some of these risk factors could be at play. Mental illness, drugs, assumption of caregiving at an early age where I resent having had to give up my life for my mom who got MS when she was 35. And then if we're looking on to the next slide, I want to just highlight a couple of these bullet points. someone who was exposed to abuse, whether it was domestic violence or other kinds of abuse within the family. For that person, abusive conduct may be normalized within their psychological infrastructure, and so it would be normal to be abusive to the elder. Another great risk factor is the high level of financial and emotional dependence that an adult child might have on a vulnerable elder. And again, a past history of having been abusive, maybe having been had the police come out for domestic violence in their own adult partner relationship, for example. Again, let me emphasize that because clergy and the church community have the privilege of seeing and knowing the dynamics of the whole family throughout the life cycles, that it's very important for us to be aware of the dynamics that could point to risk of abuse of our elder. And then in the next slide, just briefly, there are risk factors that our society and our family and our community have as well. For example, I'm thinking of a particular church where there was a very high tolerance of aggressive behavior on the part of members of the church and actually the pastor. Aggressive behavior was normalized. As I mentioned before, the family ethic or ethos of not seeking help from others. There may be a spiritual or religious belief that I will be closer, for example, I will be closer to Jesus if I just endure my suffering and remain silent. There may be negative beliefs in the culture about aging and elders. Let's just put them away. She was always difficult. Let's just let her go. And so that further isolates the elder and creates a greater risk scenario for abuse. Now, as we move on to the next slide, there are also protective factors, and this is where the faith community is essential. When an elder has numerous strong relationships, there is a boundary, there is a cushion, there is an insulation of protection when a person has friends, church, community activities that they're involved in, Meals on Wheels that they're volunteering for, or volunteering at the library, or singing in the church choir. Those strong relationships are essential. When the community has coordinated resources and services to support our elders and caregivers, it's easier to get the person help when needed. Many communities we know don't have adequate resources and agencies, and so in an area like that, I would strongly recommend that your congregation partner with other congregations to develop programs and resources. When there's a strong community cohesion and identity, whether it's in a church or a continuing care retirement community, a neighborhood where positive family and community involvement can be promoted and developed and enabled, and these are other protective factors for our elders. Briefly, on the next slide, the paradox in long-term care is that without there being loving advocates who visit regularly, a staff may be less likely to be attentive to a particular elder and more likely to mistreat them without there being any consequence to themselves. But because of the things that I've said earlier, that 90% of abuse takes place by a family member, we need to be mindful of the power and control dynamics and the risk factors of abusing when we see a relative visiting regularly. And to keep our internal radar up. If something just doesn't seem quite right, we need to pay attention to that. So as we move to the next slide, speaking of paying attention to that, the role of the church and the community, the church community and pastoral caregivers is central in witnessing and developing your relationship with the elder, your relationship with the elder's family members and the elder's friends. And if they're in a long-term care facility of any type, to develop your relationship with the direct care staff, with administrators, housekeepers, the chaplain, to develop physician-pastor partnerships on behalf of the elder who is in a long-term care facility. On our next slide, some of the warning signs that we need to pay attention to, of course, is the elder's own self-report that someone is mistreating me. Even if there is cognitive impairment going on with the elder, it still may be true, or a portion of it may be true, and so don't dismiss it. Your observation of physical signs, again, as I mentioned earlier, your nose, your eyes can detect some warning signs. You can observe the relationship dynamics, which I've tried to speak of earlier. You can observe the elder's response to their caregiver or caregivers. And you can also observe how the caregiver responds to the elder. I'm thinking of a particular situation where I was volunteering at a long-term continuing care retirement community and in the memory unit, and saw a particular caregiver treat one of the residents I was visiting in a very rough and gruff way. And I noticed after that particular visit that when I went out into the hall that I saw the same caregiver treating another resident in the same form or fashion. I contacted the family member of the first person with whom I have a relationship and said, this is what I've seen and I want to go to the nursing administration. And I was given full support to do that. I was going to do it anyway, but I wanted to give the courtesy of letting the family member know. And so I reported this cruel and neglectful treatment by the caregiver, which I had observed. What the nursing administrator said is that not everyone is suited to do this kind of work, and we need to know this. And my report was taken seriously, and that caregiver was let go. What do we do when we suspect there may be abuse? If we move to the next slide. If a person is in immediate life-threatening danger, call the police or call 911 immediately. You do not need to prove abuse. It's important that you stop yourself from going into any kind of, I'm going to investigate this, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. All that is needed to make an ethical and worthy report of abuse is that a reasonable person has a reasonable suspicion of abuse. Your confidentiality is protected if you make a report. The law protects you from prosecution if you are acting in good faith. And the law requires in most states that they are required to investigate usually within 48 hours. The number up above on the slide, the elder care locator for state-specific information can help lead you to the Adult Protective Services contact information in your state. And every state has a long-term care ombudsman. So if you are concerned about abuse in a long-term care facility and your attempts to address this within the system have been unsuccessful and have not been remediated, then you have the long-term care ombudsman in your state, and that information can also be found by contacting that elder care locator phone number. Now let's get to the role of the faith community. We in the Christian community are people of the incarnation, and that means that we believe that the Word became flesh in the life and the ministry and the witness and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we also know that the Word becomes flesh in our actual relationships with one another, that each person carries God and the life of God within them. We are embodied souls. And so now more than ever, in a world of virtual and electronic communication, our embodied relationships with one another are even more important than ever. Who are you? When I was teaching in the pastoral counseling training program in Charlotte, some of the students were very concerned about this technique or this theory, and particularly early on. And what I wanted to help them develop was more of an emotional curiosity about the person that they were working with. Who are you? What is your life story? Tell me about yourself. So our role in the faith community is to treat each person at every moment with respect for their God-given dignity. The who are you? I remember visiting an independent resident here who wasn't at home. That person whom I was visiting had a neighbor who had recently died, and a relative was cleaning out the apartment. And I saw the relative, and the relative said to me, "All these years of visiting Mom, I never knew what an interesting and delightful person he was," he being the resident I had gone to visit. "I'm so sorry that I missed knowing my mom's neighbor." So it's really important that we remember that this is an embodied person with a life history and a story. It's not merely a sweet little old lady or a sweet little old man, where we diminish who that person is as an incarnate reflection of God's love and God's life. But to treat this person as a storied, beloved individual. I spoke earlier of the importance of relationships, of the importance of knowing a person and of being known, and remember that the protective factors of who are the relationships, who are the people in the person's life that can be a support and are a support and offer protection and care. Care for the whole person throughout the life cycle is an essential role of the faith community, and so regular visitation is essential. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But if we move to the next slide, just briefly to review, some of our challenges include frustration. We feel it. It's normal. We might feel rage and resentment at our elder whose capacities are becoming more and more diminished and more challenging. Those feelings of frustration and rage and resentment are normal, but what we need as members of the faith community and people who love our elders is that we need help for ourselves to tame those feelings so that we do not take it out on our elders. The challenge is to support the elders' autonomy and independence, and then find creative ways and creative supports to intervene when, despite the person's fierce independence, their capacity to really live independently is compromised to the extent that their safety is at risk. And then finally, the challenge for us is, or another challenge for us is that we be aware of the risk factors of abuse and neglect, and not to be naive, because our naivete that this exists is a risk factor in itself. Now if we move to the next slide, please. The role of clergy. Visit your parishioners. I've heard numerous clergy through the course of my life say, I don't really like to visit the shut-ins. I don't like to visit in the hospital, you know, and besides my feeling that, well, that's actually what your role is, but it may be that in a large parish or a large congregation, the clergy person who doesn't like to visit the sick and the shut-ins and maybe shouldn't be because they don't like it, they need help to do it. And so that congregation needs to work with their clergy member and their board to develop a plan to enhance the visitation that the clergy member can't or won't do. I believe it's essential to integrate training about the prevention and recognition and response to the abuse of elders with other abuse prevention training that most denominations in the mainline churches require. So we talk about prevention of child abuse, but let's think about abuse across the life cycle and integrate the abuse of elders teachings about that and prevention and responding. It's also important for clergy to preach about the abuse of vulnerable elders, because if we name it, that means it exists. And if we don't name it, we don't ever talk about it, it means it doesn't exist. That makes it an unsafe environment for someone who's questioning how mom's being treated in her long-term care facility, for example. Because if this minister isn't talking about it from the pulpit, then how do I know that this minister will even take it seriously or will even care? It's important for clergy to take leadership in providing resources for our elders, making appropriate referrals, whether it's to the food pantry or to Meals on Wheels or for medical care or to a clinic or to adult care facilities, to take the initiative with our elders when they seem to be getting to a point where they're getting to a crossroads. How do they want to live their final years? What are their resources? What kinds of decisions can they be making? And to try to help lead them without dragging them where they don't want to go. Also providing the resource of transportation for our elders. Finally, as far as the role of clergy for today, let me talk about the self-monitoring and getting pastoral supervision. Is your minister courting the wealthy elders? Is your minister avoiding the difficult to visit? So we need to be relentlessly honest with ourselves and have support around ourselves so that we can raise these difficult questions of, I really don't like going to see so-and-so, the shut-in, and to have a caring, supportive pastoral supervisor who can say, well, let's look at what goes on, what's getting triggered in you. Okay, yes, this is a difficult person, but how can you get out front of that so that you're not either denying or ignoring that person, or, for example, not wanting to go into a poorer section of a big city because it's more comfortable for me as a minister to visit people in the Tony house rather than the subsidized housing. Again, needing to develop a plan to enhance visitation. And then if we look at the next slide, the role of the faith community can be also in developing Stephen ministry and other kinds of caregiving teams. A congregation or group of congregations could partner to offer caregiver support groups for family members, for friends, for staff, for personal care assistants. Intergenerational programming that can promote embodied lifelong relationships of respect and care. As I was thinking about that before today, I was remembering that something that was very formative to me that was in my own church of my childhood having every Christmas, there was a craft making event where we could sit at tables and we could make pine cone Christmas wreaths, and we could make door decorations with ribbons and so forth. And little Sarah was sitting next to other people who were in families and grandparents and so forth. That was a very happy, delightful memory for me. Formative for me also in my childhood was that we always stopped on the way to church to pick up Mrs. Howell, and we took her home after church. Mrs. Howell was a widow who didn't drive, and so that kind of care and attention from the faith community as far as driving people to church, making sure they can get to their medical appointments, shopping, taking someone out for lunch, getting them to 12-step meetings to promote their own wellness. The faith community is essential in helping our elders have a quality of life and to have a safe life that is protected and loved. And finally, it's important for congregations and clergy to provide regular support and pastoral supervision to, say you have a Stephen ministry group or another kind of caregiving group of lay visitors. It's important to provide regular meetings for those people to debrief and to talk about some of what they're encountering with some of the people they're visiting, addressing what are countertransference challenges. By that I mean, what are our own internal responses and feelings to the elder. Our own internal responses and feelings may be very positive, but they can also be distorted. So we need support so that we, and supervision so that we don't act inappropriately. I'm remembering particularly a chaplain I supervised who laid in bed every time she visited the elder, a particular elder in a nursing home, because the elder reminded her of her grandmother. So that's what I mean by her own internal response was positive, but it was distorted and it was inappropriate and was abusive. Other kinds of countertransference experiences you might have, I just don't like this person, that I'm visiting, or I'm feeling overwhelmed with my own responsibilities, or I'm overwhelmed with grief because I love this elder and she's dying. Another possible distorted expression of countertransference, again, our own internal response or reaction to someone, the need spiritually, religiously to save someone, make sure that they're saved, or saving them from death, which we can't. And another really virulent or toxic, I should say, countertransference would be racial and ethnic prejudice and religious prejudice. I don't like visiting people of this race. I don't like Native Americans. I don't like visiting Jewish people. I don't like Jewish people. That kind of thing needs intervention on the part of the people who are coordinating a caregiving team to protect the elder from that kind of prejudice and hatred. Our next slides are going to list some of the many, many rich resources that are available to you through FaithTrust Institute and through other entities online and elsewhere. You will be getting a copy of these slides that will provide that information for you in a handy way. And so after you just have a brief look at these next couple of slides, we will have time for your questions and comments.
Thank you, Sarah. You covered a lot of information in a very short time. So I have a question for you, and it was about the issue of spiritual abuse, which you mentioned earlier. I'm wondering if you could just define that or give a little further explanation of what spiritual abuse is.
Well, there's a whole other webinar, Sarah, but I was trying to address some of that at the end here, especially the kind of spiritual abuse that would be taking my own religious orientation and wanting to thrust that upon the elder, forcing someone, not meeting a person where they are in their own spiritual journey, but demanding, requiring, forcing them to be somewhere else. Also, the kind of shaming and humiliation that often goes on in spiritually abusive sects and denominations. Again, it's a matter of internal monitoring and external monitoring to make sure that we're not, within our own faith communities, pushing our own agenda and our own spiritual agenda on. It's the power and control, again, exhibited in a spiritual kind of way or a spiritual context.
Thank you. We have a question from Montreal, and he's asking, does it make sense to say that usually church communities promote youth and development of community, whereas taking care of the elderly is something that is community building, but it's not necessarily, quote, going anywhere in terms of development of the community, unless we firmly believe we are able to address elderly people as the very center of our community? So apparently this was a little bit of a light bulb moment. You have any response to that idea?
Yes, I think it's a really wonderful question as well as the first one. I've seen this quite a bit. You see it in periodicals, religious periodicals. Our church is looking to grow, and we want a young clergy person to revitalize our congregation. Of course, the congregation is primarily made of elders, say, at this time, and so that congregation ends up being neglected, and the people who are already there in the actual embodied community not taken seriously, because the real life of the church is with the people who haven't gotten there yet. My tongue is in my cheek as I say this, the young people who have the money and can bring the money into the church. So I'm carrying the banner for clergy and congregations to be attentive to who is really there and who are their real members. Not to say not to try to grow the congregation and be welcoming to the community and welcoming of others, and making sure that young people are being given the opportunity to be formed in a spiritual or religious tradition, but who also, not only the elders who are there, but who are the elders who are not there, who can't get there anymore. But this was their church for decades, and they were married there, and their children were baptized there, but now they're in an assisted living somewhere, and they need to know that they still matter. I've had people say to me when I would be taking communion to them in a nursing home or care center, well, you know, I feel so bad I can't get to church anymore. And it's like, and that's okay, because now it's time for the church to come to you.
That's beautifully said. I have a question here from a woman who is an advocate who has tried to reach out to the faith community to build partnership with churches and congregations regarding elder abuse, and she hasn't received any response. So she's wondering if you have any suggestions for ways to get past that barrier of reluctance to connect.
I would say continue to have that fierce, relentless, loving commitment to do it. I'd be happy for that person to be in touch with me, that we could have more conversation offline about that, to know more about the specifics of it, of the situation. But the need is very great, and I commend this person for her efforts and her loving kindness to try to build loving community and loving partnerships to make our elders safe.
And we actually do have a webinar that I will send that was specifically on developing community relationships with faith communities and advocates. So that is a resource we have available to anyone. One last question here. Let's see. So the question is, can you respond or address briefly the situation where there are wealthier shut-in elders who are visited and those with fewer resources who are more vulnerable do not necessarily get the same visitation and care from their pastor?
I have my own countertransference reaction to the question, which is I find that situation abhorrent. And frankly, lacking in moral compass, because it's an abuse of power, not only the neglect and slighting of a precious child of God who does not have financial resources, but the courting of someone for example, the minister's personal gain, perhaps, or the congregation's gain. We need a new stained glass window. We're building a new building. That kind of courting, I think, is a gross abuse of power because it turns the relationship and the ethic of care, where the pastor is there to serve the needs of the congregation, it turns it upside down so that the congregation, or in this case, the wealthy elder, is there to serve the church's need and perhaps the minister's need. So the ethic of service and the core intent of the pastoral relationship has been violated and compromised in its integrity.
Okay. One quick question for you, Sarah. The statistics that you quoted earlier, were those based on national census statistics in terms of abuse?
Yes. The census figure was, yes, and all of it, I don't have the citations right in front of me. They're in my notes, and but I know that they are all available in the resources that are named at the end of this webinar on the slides. You'll be able to access all of that information and so much more.
Great, thank you. This is our very last question. I'm sorry, folks. The question is about the representation of violence in the Old and New Testaments and how that relates to our personal experiences of violence, and how do we justify. Do you get where I'm going with this, Sarah?
I'm not quite sure what the question is about that. I'm on board as far as, yes, the violence in Holy Scripture.
Yeah, I guess the question is about, is there a biblically based approach to countering elder abuse, given that there's so much violence in sacred Scripture? Big question.
Another webinar, but for me, the answer is in the life and the ministry and the witness of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, who met people right where they are, who suffered violence for the sake of living a life of faithful integrity, but who lived a life of nonviolence, and that is
yeah, excellent example.
I mean, it's the life of Jesus that was devoted to nonviolence and to bringing people in from outside the margins and restoring them to full community, those who were shamed, who were isolated, who were, because of the religious purity laws of Judaism at that time in his life, were marginalized and unable to be considered part of the full community. So Jesus' whole life was about that, and about love and care. And what did he say is the greatest commandment, is to love our God with all our heart and mind and soul and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I'm not seeing room for violence in that.
Beautifully said, Sarah. Thank you so much. It's time for us to close up. We're running a little late, so I'm going to go ahead and mute you now. I want to thank you all for joining us today for today's webinar, and Sarah Reith, you are wonderful. Thank you. We also want to show our appreciation to the United Methodist Women for sponsoring today's webinar. I apologize for the questions that we weren't able to get to. I hope that you'll take a moment when you leave to fill out the survey questions and give us your feedback on today's webinar, future webinar presentations, topics that you'd like to see us cover. You can view all of our upcoming webinars online at faithtrustinstitute.org. We have two. Our next is on June 23rd, Intimate Partner Violence in Same-Sex Relationships, a Pastoral Care Roundtable. That should be very interesting. And please remember, June 15th is Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and that would be a great opportunity to share the information and resources that you received today with your friends, families, colleagues, and faith community. I hope that you will join us for a future webinar, and thank you so much for being with us today.